Tolkien had been fascinated by the Anglo-Saxons, and Beowulf especially, from a very young age. While for many centuries the text and Old English in general had been overlooked by English intellectuals in favor of Greek and Latin, in the late 19th to early 20th century, something changed. Beowulf, now regarded as perhaps one of the most important texts in the history of the English language, finally came under the radar of scholars and enjoyed considerable analysis before and during Tolkien's own time in academia. That analysis, however, seemed to focus more on the historical aspect of the poem and its contribution to understanding the ancient Anglo-Saxons than for what it actually was, a poem. One with monsters, kings and armies, a tale of legendary quests, the true intention of its long-forgotten author. These are what captured the imagination of a young Tolkien who was already intrigued by language, and he would read the poem again and again and again. He would quote it to his friends in the original tongue and recite it silently to his mesmerized students while at Oxford. As the years passed, it became clear that the professor had both the passion and the skills to perhaps even officially translate the text itself, something that Tolkien eventually did. And while Tolkien's translation of Beowulf is one of the most renowned, there is even a greater contribution to the poem that Tolkien provided. You see, in 1926, at just the age of 34, Tolkien had already managed to finish his translation of Beowulf. That translation, however, was never published during his own lifetime. The professor, being the perfectionist that he was, especially regarding something he cared about so deeply, would write, rewrite, and write again over his translation for many years, something that coincided with his appointment to the University of Oxford and the writing of a little book called The Hobbit. In this context, Tolkien had little time to dedicate to publishing his translation, a version of which was finally published by his son Christopher in 2014. The important thing that Tolkien gained from this experience, however, even if he never published his work, was an unparalleled understanding of Beowulf itself, an understanding he would go on to use for his acclaimed 1936 lecture, Beowulf, the Monster and the Critics. A lecture that, in no uncertain terms, changed the popular perception of studying Beowulf forever. In order to truly understand the professor's work, however, allow me to provide a brief overview of the story of Beowulf. It is unknown who wrote the poem, whether it was passed down in oral tradition, when exactly it was written, or what the work was actually called by its contemporaries. Therefore, it has been named after its protagonist, Beowulf, a legendary hero called to aid the king of the Danes in order to deal with the dreaded monster Grendel. Because of this, the poem is known for its three great battles. The first is with Grendel himself, who is killed by Beowulf's bare hands. The second is that with Grendel's mother, who following her beloved son's death wreaks havoc and is eventually put down by the now exalted hero. And the third, with the dragon, takes place many decades later in what is now Beowulf's own realm, after our hero had become the king of his people. After a dragon had begun terrorizing the land, King Beowulf gathered his warriors to hunt down and destroy the monster. When the moment finally came to face the beast, however, the king made a mistake. With his previous victories burning in his memory and filling him with pride, Beowulf believes he can overcome the dragon by himself. Beowulf is successful, he manages to slay the dragon, but in the process he becomes mortally wounded and ultimately dies. Beyond the plot, however, the most important thing to remember in order to truly understand the context of academic analysis of Beowulf is this. The story is written by and for the Anglo-Saxons in Old English, but takes place in Scandinavia before the Anglo-Saxon migration to the British Isles. It has Christian themes and morals, but it also heavily mixes them with pagan ones. It is written by someone who isn't a pagan, however, and also not located in Scandinavia. Beowulf has the capacity of providing invaluable information about the POV, if you will, of the people of its time. They were descendants of the pagans, yet they were Christian. Their ancestors came from the continent, yet they are in England. The story is filled with mythological and legendary figures and monsters, and yet has a basis in real-life historical figures and events. It has the ability to provide invaluable information on the warrior culture of that time, how those people lived and interacted with kingly authority, as well as their code of honor. And it is precisely because of this that the vast majority of Beowulf scholarly analysis focused on what the poem could provide on an exclusively historical level, that all it could do was shine more light on the Anglo-Saxons. In this, Tolkien disagreed, and that is precisely what he examines in his famous lecture, and how he pivoted the way in which Beowulf has been seen in intellectual circles for the past 90 years. Tolkien delved deep into the nature of Beowulf, in its very purpose as a poem first of all. In the past, the story and the plot of Beowulf had been discounted by critics for being too simple, and Tolkien recognizes this in his lecture. What he also recognizes, however, is the complexity hidden behind that seemingly simple plot. Yes, Beowulf is essentially a rundown of its hero's 3 fights, with the final one leading to his death in the midst of victory. But what does that truly mean? What it means is that Tolkien sees these 3 fights as something infinitely more. As the name of the lecture suggests, he places emphasis on the antagonistic forces of those fights, on the monsters themselves. Each of them seems similar in themes, but are distinct in character, and Tolkien makes the argument that in the era that the poem was written, the monsters came to represent the forces of darkness and of evil, those that stood against God. Whereas in the past scholars had dismissed the monsters as simple remnants of folklore, Tolkien recognized the incredible emotional weight that they carried. What Beowulf was fighting was not just a story or a fun legend to sing around the campfire. He was fighting chaos itself, evil, and, most important of all, and perhaps the poem's greatest influence on Tolkien himself, Beowulf was fighting his own mortality. It is death and existential dread that characterize the emotional undertones of the poem, and there are no better examples of this than the fights that make up its, on the surface, simple plot. The monster Grendel's violent death brings about the wrath of his mother, who herself is also put down. This glorious but violent triumph over evil, characterized by the northern themes of courage, feuds with the Christian dichotomy of light and darkness, as highlighted by Tolkien, culminate in the pride of Beowulf in his final fight. Up to Tolkien's time, the majority opinion was that the dragon was simply that, a dragon, an adversary to finish the story. Beowulf's bane, as he came to be called, in actuality, is the epitome of the poem's emotional journey. The dragon represents the hostility, the danger of the world against mankind, and the evil that rules it, death. Beowulf is courageous, and he perfectly embodies the warrior spirit of his people, and yet he cannot truly overcome the dragon. Throughout the poem we get the idea that he might, that he is powerful enough to reach new heights, to be stronger and better, godlike even, and yet, despite of his achievements, godlike he is not. He is just a man, and like any man, he too dies. This is the dragon that humanity has to grapple with, and this is why Tolkien loved myths, and this myth specifically, so much. And, in addition to this incredible fusion of Norse pagan ideals like the heroic death and courage, in combination to Christianity's outlook on mortality and evil, we would be remiss not to mention Beowulf's themes regarding greed. After all, it was someone stealing from the hoard of the dragon that unleashed the wrath of the beast across the realm. And of course, it was the dragon's greed that led to its fight and death against Beowulf. And so from this, we can see the plague of greed from both sides of the human and the monster. Finally, I think the best way to see Tolkien's love and admiration for Beowulf as the piece of literature that it is, as opposed to just a historical document, is how he ended his famous lecture, saying, "If the funeral of Beowulf moved once like the echo of an ancient dirge, far off and hopeless, it is to us a memory brought over the hills, an echo of an echo. There is not much poetry in the world like this, and though Beowulf may not be among the very greatest poems of our Western world and its tradition, it has its own individual character and peculiar solemnity. It would still have power had it been written in some time or place unknown and without posterity, if it contained no name that could now be recognized or identified by research. Yet it is in fact written in a language that, after many centuries, has still essential kinship with our own. It was made in this land, and moves in our northern world, beneath our northern sky. And for those who are native to that tongue and land, it must ever call with a profound appeal, until the dragon comes." A massive thank you to my channel members, and thank you very much for watching.